to begin our fourth panel. The fourth panel of our workshop will consist of a travel from Greece to Iran and then to Pakistan. Without further ado, the floor belongs to Dr. Charalambos Kouroundis. Charalabe.
Thank you very much, Costas, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you, but okay, let's start. Populism has been broadly discussed in recent scholarship. In this debate, populist constitutionalism, first developed, as we know, in the United States in the early 90s, has moved in the direction of citizen empowerment. Therefore, it posed a challenge to the dominant notion of representative democracy that limits the democratic principle of self-determination to the electoral procedure. In my presentation, I will try to examine two great moments of the Greek political and constitutional history: the July days of 1965 and the formation of the new Constitution of 1975 through the prism of constitutional populists such as Parker, Tasnet, and Balkin. This way, we may trace the historical constitutional lens between these moments and contemporary debate, where any popular intervention in the political scene is exorcised as mere populism. So, let's start from the beginning. After the liberation from the Axis occupation in October 1944, Greece followed a different pattern compared with the other Western European countries, as no progressive institutional or constitutional change has been initiated. Despite the fact that the left constituted the major resistance force during the German occupation and was in actual control of most Greek territory when the occupying forces started withdrawing, for a variety of reasons which cannot be developed here, it subsequently suffered a complete military defeat. During the bitter civil war of 1946 to 1949, the right-wing parliamentary majority has prepared a deeply conservative constitution, which was finally voted by a centrist parliamentary majority in 1951 and started to apply in 1952. Moreover, the center and the right maintained the Civil War institutional edifice through a parallel constitution called Parasyntagma. According to the latter, the Communist Party was outlawed and an intricate set of legal mechanisms of repression was institutionalized to exclude left-wing forces from political activity and prevent workers from being collectively organized in militant unions. Given all that, it did not seem bizarre that EDA, the left-wing party of the era, has voted against the Constitution of 1952 and characterized it as the libro d'oro of the oligarchy. In the late 50s, the right, which had been governing the country from 1952, started losing its hold. A clear sign for this was the spectacular 1958 election gains of EDA, which ended up becoming the main opposition in parliament. In 1961, the Pericles contingency plan, devised for the purpose of neutralizing the communists in case of war, was used by the right to achieve victory in the elections, known since then as the elections of violence and fraud. To give an example, in one provincial constituency, 14,000 ballot papers were written on hand, violating the secrecy of the vote. Moreover, the blatant intervention in the electoral process turned, this time, not only against the left, but also against the center. As a result, the leader of the Center Union, Georgios Papandreou, a fierce anti-communist who managed to reunite the centrist parties, did not recognize the election results. On the contrary, he initiated the so-called anendotos agonas, meaning unyielding struggle. This struggle has been expressed through massive mobilizations with the participation of centrists and leftists altogether. In his speeches, Papandreou expressed a strong notion of the people as opposed to the elite and claimed to represent the common people against a corrupt and unresponsive elite establishment. In these mobilizations, the Article 114 of the Constitution of 1952, stating that the observance of the current Constitution is entrusted to the patriotism of the Greeks, became the main slogan of the movement. The masses were singing it with passion, and the movement was given the name the Movement of 114, as it was shouted in the streets. Some months later, the court with the jurisdiction to check the election's validity decided that the elections had been conducted legally. For example, the aforementioned massive use of handwritten ballot papers was found legal because the law provided that in case of absence of printed ballot papers, the voters could use handwritten ones. However, the most interesting is that these court decisions were conceived by the people as a proof that the courts were also part of the problem. In other words, these decisions showed the people that they should defend the Constitution not only against the political elite, but also against the judges. The movement of 114 may seem paradoxical, as the existing Constitution of 1952, as I said before, was too conservative to be defended from a radical perspective. However, the lower classes did not refer to the Constitution as legal experts. In a nutshell, the 114 slogan proves that they conceived the Constitution as a text that guarantees the sovereignty and the rights of the people. Therefore, the people did not only adopt for itself the role of the guardian of the Constitution, but it also became the Constitution's interpreter. The 114 movement reminds us of Peter Heberle's notion of the citizens, the movements, and the parties as consisting the open society of constitutional interpreters. Even more, it reminds us of Jack Balkin, who argued in his Living Originalism that a constitution should be conceived not only as basic law and higher law, but also as our law. This conception admits that people are attached to the Constitution, feel a sense of ownership of it, and see it as the product of their collective efforts. Thus, Balkin's theory of framework originalism treats the Constitution as a framework that sets politics in motion and leaves much space for the citizen to fill in through what he calls constitutional constructions. When citizens do not accept the decisions of the courts or the politicians, they exercise their right to claim the Constitution as theirs and not as property of those in power. That is exactly what the movement of 114 did. Sorry. In any case, this was just the beginning of the story. The intensification of the political struggle led to an increasingly marked polarization and finally induced King Paul to precipitate the fall of the right-wing Karamanlis government in June 1963. The Center Union won the elections twice, the second time with an extraordinary 52.72%. However, in July 1965, King Constantine forced Prime Minister Papandreou to resign. The reason was the latter wanted to assume the Ministry of National Defense, but the king refused to nominate him. After Papandreou's resignation, the king nominated prime minister to his successive prime ministers to his liking, and engineered a split in the Center Union to get them voted. Many MPs of the party, led by Konstantin Mitsotakis, father of our current prime minister, abandoned the Center Union to form a new party, which turned out to form a government with the support of the right. In the same time, the movement of the unyielding struggle returned massively to the streets to demonstrate against the crown. 400 demonstrations, two of them with hundreds of thousands of participants, took place in 40 days. This time, the 114 slogan was combined with the demand for a referendum on the abolition of monarchy. How can we explain the fact that the same people invoked an article which entrusted the observance of the current constitution to the people, the same time that they shouted a slogan challenging the form of the regime that this constitution provided? How can we explain that? This antinomy can be explained if we take into consideration the nature of the constitutional issue that was at stake. This issue can be reduced to a simple question. Who is the sovereign, the king or the people? The two slogans, 114 and referendum, seem contradictory, but in fact, they reflect the reorientation of people's interpretation of the Constitution in the new situation of July days. In a nutshell, the new people's constitutional interpretation can be summarized as follows. As soon as the Constitution is a text that guarantees the sovereignty and the rights of the people, the king should limit himself in his symbolic constitutional duties. Otherwise, the people as sovereign should be able to decide if his reign would continue. In any case, the huge popular mobilizations of the July days, which made some scholars refer to them as the premature Greek May, referring to May 68, have been heavily criticized by the right and the crown as ochlocratic disorder. The ruling social and political forces blamed the demonstrators for trying to impose their will on the representatives of the nation. In order to justify the split of the pro-royalist MPs of the Central Union and their collision with the right, the leader of the right, Panayotis Kanellopoulos, reduced popular sovereignty to the election of MPs. To his interpretation of the free mandate replied the leader of EDA, Elias Iou, who invoked French constitutional theory, Carré de Malbert, Barthélemy, Diaz, and Vedel, in order to stress that demonstrations should not be equated with mob rule. He argued precisely that the only way to realize popular sovereignty is when the represented exercise their collective rights to form unions, demonstrate, and strike in order to demand from their representatives to fulfill the political promises that consist their mandate. This conception defended popular sovereignty in terms that reminds us of the fact that the representative system was from the beginning consciously not constituted upon the Hobbesian basis of absolute representation. The First Amendment of the American Constitution, for example, as Bruce Ackerman and Bernard Manin have shown, has been voted in order to combine representation with freedom of public opinion, namely expressed through the press, demonstrations, and petitions. More generally, the July days was a manifest example of what Richard Parker might have had in mind when he wrote that anti-populists treat popular political energy as a problem, while populists think that popular political energy makes for better government, responsive to ordinary people whom it purports to serve. On the other hand, the July days relativize in a certain way Mark Tasnet's interpretation of the thick and the thin constitution, where the former contains provisions describing how the government is to be organized, while the latter refers to the fundamental rights. According to Tasnet, thick constitutions provisions do not thrill the heart and do not generate impassioned declarations, while thin constitutions provisions do so. During the July days, people marched massively on a matter regarding the thick constitution, not the thin one. In the same time, this Greek exception has proved Tasnet right in another issue, namely his claim that the constitutional law is deeply integrated in the institutional, doctrinal, social, and cultural framework of each country. In Greece, people used to be highly interested in the organization of government because it has been historically connected with the violation of fundamental rights. Sorry.
Babis, you have 7 minutes, okay?
I won't use all of them. Thank you for the for reminding me of that. Now, after the collapse of the dictatorship, the right-wing party, now named New Democracy, won the elections with 54%, obtaining a large parliamentary majority of 216 seats. After a referendum where the people voted for the abolition of monarchy by a vast majority of almost 70%, the government presented a draft constitution that would replace the constitution of 1952. In fact, it was presented as a revision of the constitution of 1952 formally, but okay, it's a different question. This draft upheld the parallel constitution of the Civil War era and posed severe restrictions to the exercise of individual and political liberties. The Prime Minister, again Konstantin Karamanlis, stated with a rather Bonapartist tone that the people entrusted to me the power. They have not told me how to exercise it. However, the final text of the Constitution was rather different than the draft one. The most important change was that it put an end to the parallel constitution. How can we explain this difference? How can we explain it? the difference between the draft constitution and the final text should not be attributed to the balance of forces inside the governmental party. What happened, in fact, was that the lower classes mobilized massively in order to ensure that the collapse of the colonel's dictatorship would not be followed by a mere return to the post-Civil War institutional edifice. From its part, the government understood that if it ignored the popular pressure, it would risk the legitimation of the new constitution. As Karamanlis himself has declared, I formed my constitution after a dictatorship where it was normal that people demanded more freedom. Thus, the crucial factor explaining the difference between the draft constitution and the final text is the mass radicalization that followed the collapse of the colonel's dictatorship in 1974 and forced Karamanlis to abandon the Civil War institutional heritage. From this point of view, the popular mobilization in 1974 and 1975 showed that the role of the social movements is very important not only when the constitution is applied, but also when it is shaped. So the political and social mobilization it was crucial to determine that the Greek constitution would not continue the conservative pattern of the constitution of 1952 in the same way as the activity of the civil rights movement was crucial for the adoption of the 24th Amendment in 1964 in the United States. In other words, following Bruce Ackerman and Jennifer New, who characterized the 60s as one of the great eras of popular sovereignty in American history, one can argue that the July days and the first period of the collapse of the dictatorship consist two great moments of popular sovereignty in Greek history. To sum up, populist constitutionalism recognizes politics in a democracy as a constant perturbing argument. Therefore, it reminds us of the fact that constitutions reflect the will of people in their sovereign capacity, and it is precisely for this reason that they can limit and control government. That was the case of Greece during the 60s and 70s, when popular political energy took over the streets to confront the ruling social and political establishment, namely the king, the right, the army. As a result, Greece's third republic was different compared not only to the dictatorship, but also to the restricted democracy of the post-Civil War era. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charalambos. The floor now passes to Mr. Panayotis Tritsibidas, who is a PhD candidate and will speak about the Iranian Revolution and Foucault's concept of the right of the governed. Please.
Thank you, Costas, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Can you see it? Is it okay?
Yes, we can see it. Yes, yes, please.
Thank you. I would like to take the chance to also thank the organizers for all their effort to put this conference together. And of course, all the panelists from yesterday and today who made it so great with their remarkable presentation. So my presentation is about the Iranian Revolution of 1979. It's something that I've been working on as part of my PhD. but also of a book that I translated in Greek and recently came out. You should be able to see it here. It's basically a collection of all Foucault's texts on the Iranian Revolution. So my background is in political science, political theory, not constitutional law. And my post-populism is heavily influenced by the Essex School, the work of Laclau and Stavrakakis as well. But what I find very challenging and interesting in the PopCon project and the literature on populist constitutionalism is that it looks at populism from the perspective of its institutionalization, or it examines its constitutional practices, real and possible. Whereas the discursive approach that we employ in political science tends to look at populism from the perspective of its mobilization. It examines how it works as a strategy, a specific logic of constructing a collective identity and a political frontier. A revolution is by definition the site where these two aspects or levels intersect. And it just so happens that the Iranian Revolution has been long characterized as a populist revolution by many leading scholars of the field. So by examining this historical case along with Foucault's analysis, I aim to draw some potentially fruitful insights about this interplay between populist mobilization and its institutionalization. It is a work in progress. In the first part of the presentation, I will present the Iranian Revolution as a populist revolution, engaging with the relevant bibliography. And in the second, I will turn to Foucault's controversial reportage to focus on the way he conceptualized it as an exercise of a negative right of the governed. And I argue that this concept captures an aspect of populism, or perhaps a type of populism, that diverges from the reclamation of a positive constitutive power based on popular sovereignty, with which populism is usually associated, both in terms of theory and practice. I'll start with a quick overview of the historical conditions in which the Iranian Revolution took place. We have to note that it wasn't the first, but the second revolution that took place in Iran in the 20th century. The first was the Constitutional Revolution that started in 1905. It was made by a coalition of secular and religious forces who rallied together against the arbitrary rule of the Qajar monarchy and the concessions it had made to Russia and Great Britain. This coalition achieved the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. A new constitution was drawn, the first constitution of Iran, that produced two important legal institutions: an elected parliament called the Majli that would exercise legislative power, and a council composed by 5 Shia clerics who would have the power to veto any legislation they deemed contrary to Islamic law. However, the revolutionary coalition disintegrated after its victory, and the secular forces managed to sideline the religious ones. So this Islamic council never convened and never exercised its role of constitutional control. So this was the first broken constitutional promise towards the religious forces. Over the next decades, the parliament functioned, even though elections were often controlled by the Shah. This changed in 1953 with a coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, who spearheaded a movement for the nationalization of Iranian oil. After this coup, which was organized by the British and US Secret Services, Iran effectively transitioned from a constitutional to an absolute monarchy. There was a crackdown on all opposition parties. They were all banned, along with the trade unions, and Iran became a one-party state. And so this, after 53, is the source of the second broken constitutional promises, the one towards the secular forces that were in parliament. So we come to the 60s and the 70s, where thanks to generous government spending funded by oil income, the Shah succeeded in transforming the country economically and socially. Iran became an urbanized country, partly industrialized, with a centralized state and a modern class structure. The state led the country to capitalist development, with all the contradictions and dispossessions this entails. But there was a sharp contrast between the economic modernization and the political despotism with which the country was ruled. Savak, the secret police, was everywhere, brutally cracking down on all political or union activity. There was no freedom of press, and many ethnic minorities were repressed. Only in the area of women's rights, there were some progressive reforms. So the regime was what was called a modernizing dictatorship that provided no institutional channels for any social or political demands to be voiced. It was also called an economic giant and a political dwarf. It had now aborted this democratic transition with Islamic oversight promised by the Constitutional Revolution of 2005. But all the grievances of the secular and religious forces were not forgotten and were reactivated in 1978, along with this coalition, this paradoxical coalition itself. This is important, this historical background, because it shows that the organizers placed me in the right panel. Because the Iranian Revolution of 1978 was not a proto-populist or an early populist revolution, because it stepped on the broken constitutional promises of the 2006 revolution. But now the socioeconomic context was very, very different. And it has been argued that the Iranian Revolution, in this sense, was the first modern revolution, because it took place in the urban centers of a fairly developed industrialized society through waves of general strikes and massive demonstration. This distinguishes it from the historical setting, let's say, of the American, the French, and even the Russian Revolution, as well as from other anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, such as Algeria or Vietnam, because there was different means of contestation used. So let's move to the revolution itself. And this is a photo where you can see the historical background that I just mentioned. There is, I think, a photo of Mossadegh in the background, the Khomeini, and there is this banner. Why is it populist? Why can we call it populist? Let's see why many leading scholars have adopted such a point of view. Halliday, I will not read the quotations, just want to stress that it was, he stressed that it's a wide-ranging alliance of many social groups: civil service, the trading communities, the bazaars, and the urban population. Moghadam chronologically and analytically distinguished two revolutions that occurred in Iran between 78 and 79. The first was a populist revolution, the product of a populist coalition with a populist discourse. And the second was the Islamic Revolution, during which the regime of the Islamic Republic was established and consolidated its power. This second revolution was marked by the dissolution of the populist coalition that was united in the first. And for Abrahamian, it was Khomeini's, which is the movement, the ideology named after Khomeini, can be best described not as Islamic fundamentalism, but as third world populism, because it was primarily concerned with socio-political issues, and it pitted the Mostazafin, the oppressed, against the Mustakberin, the oppressors. So from a discourse theoretical view, we can say that the Iranian Revolution followed the logic in the stages of populism described by Laclau. There were multiple and heterogeneous demands which could not be satisfied by the existing institutional order because all channels for their differential management were blocked. The demands thus became connected, forming a coalition on the basis of their shared antagonism towards the dictatorship of the Shah, the foreign powers supporting him, and the domestic elites benefiting from the regime. So let's have a quick look at the political composition of this coalition. We could even call it a populist bloc because we had three different political spaces. We had the liberal nationalists, which was the freedom movement of Bazargan, who later became the prime minister after the revolution. And this political space was in a relationship of continuity with the National Front of Mossadegh, who was, as we said before, failed to and was crushed. And we also had the revolutionary left in Iran, with a pro-Soviet Communist Party, Tudeh, and two pretty big organizations that were guerrilla and then adopted a different approach, the Fedayeen and the Mujahideen. And we also had the clergy, the Ayatollahs, which were many. It wasn't only Khomeini, because it has to do with how the Shia clergy itself is structured. And they had different political views as well, different approaches. Some were more liberal, some were more radical. So let's also see what was the social composition. We can call this an interclassist movement, because it was composed both by modern and traditional middle classes, working classes, and the urban sub-proletariat that was created during the 60s and 70s, mainly as a result of the internal migration and urbanization of Iran, as well as a strong student movement. So the way that the Shah fell was actually through waves of general strikes, which had political and economic demands. And because the trade unions were outlawed, they were organized by workers' committees and had the result of freezing the economy for virtually 2 or 3 months, and the oil revenues, which was a big blow to the Shah. And what's very interesting is that some of these, in some factories, these worker committees, these strike committees, evolved into workers' councils. Shura, there was a movement of worker councils inside and after the Iranian Revolution. The second very important part of the resistance and from the social forces was the massive demonstrations. It has also been said that in the Iranian Revolution was the first in terms of the percentage of the population that participated in it. They had demonstrations with 5 million people in a country with 40 million people. And there was a very significant women participation. I will not go. So there were also the mosques that functioned as centers of resistance. And there was a lot of grassroots organization inside the revolution. So let's now pass to Khomeini, which we can see here being held by many protesters. Khomeini, who was in Paris during the revolution and landed in Tehran after the Shah had left the country, became the symbol of the popular bloc, the part that represented the whole, i.e. the counter-hegemonic force. He achieved this by being the public figure that insisted more than any other on the deposition of the Shah, which the masses were already calling for in their demonstrations and strikes. He was just saying no to the Shah, as Foucault observed, without providing any program as to what would replace him. In this way, he functioned as an empty signifier that could embody all the refusals and hopes of the population. In Islamic populism, the Ummah, the community of the believers, takes the place of the people. In the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini interpolated the people as Shia Muslims oppressed by the Shah and the Western powers. Religious identity provided a positive yet minimum common denominator through which a unified and antagonistic people emerged. And here, Shia Islam with its narratives of martyrdom and antagonism also played an important role. But by becoming the counter-hegemonic figure during the stage of the mobilizations, Khomeini found himself in an advantageous position to assume the role of the ruler after the overthrow of the Shah and the creation of the so-called power vacuum. After the victory of the revolution, the populist coalition started to slowly disintegrate, and the religious flank of Khomeini managed to win the power struggle. It gradually turned against all his political opponents with very violent means, as well as many social groups that took part in the revolutions and many of the institutions the grassroots institutions that were developed. The Islamic Republic was established by 2 referenda that were held in 1979, which produced the new constitution. This new constitution, which is a very peculiar document, enshrined both an elitist theocratic governance, and this was the principle of Velayat Faqih, which basically says that the top Islamic jurist has to be the supreme leader of the country. But there was also elements of popular sovereignty, both in the way that the referenda produced these constitutions, but there was also an elected parliament and a president elected by the people. So there is in Islamic Republic, as we, from hearing it, we see there is a tension between democracy and theocracy, which is solved in favor of theocracy, of course. So we can say that Khomeinism ruled as an authoritarian populism, premised on the exclusion of multiple social, political, and ethnic groups, but also the inclusion of others. And I would particularly through social policies and state employment of what he called the downtrodden. So now we can turn to Foucault's reportage. Here he is when he arrived at the airport in Tehran. He visited twice Iran and wrote articles for the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. So far, our analysis, together with the bibliography, establishes that the Iranian Revolution was the outcome of a populist movement. Thus, we can say that in Foucault's Iranian reportage, there is a de facto encounter with populism, even an Havana letter analysis of populism. He analyzed the revolt in two axes. The first was the construction of a collective will. It's one of the key notions he uses. And the other was the creation of counter institutions and counter contacts animated by political spirituality. But I will focus on the third key notion. Because when things turned out as awfully as they did in this revolution, what he highlighted was the irreducibility of the Iranian revolt to the revolutionary forms of power it led to. And he did this by registering the irreducible gap between the levels of mobilization and institutionalization as two different realities, but the question immediately comes, what do revolts or revolutions produce, if not a people as a unified subject, and the new institutional order based on its sovereignty, as happened in the case of this the Iranian Revolution? Foucault's answer is that they produce a right of the governed. We come here to a point that pertains to populism, possible intersections with constitutionalism. Foucault termed the collective actions undertaken by the Iranian people as a political and juridical act, an act of public right. He conceptualized the revolt in Iran as the enactment of a right of the governed that functions as the ultimate historically effective way for the governed to impose some limits on the power of the governments or to depose them. We have this quote here, and it shows that there is this move away from popular sovereignty and the idea of a constituent power, where basically he says that populist movements do not necessarily claim a constituent power against a constituted, yet illegitimate power, but also a negative power, a right to abolish. In the articles he wrote during the uprising, he conceived the idea of Islamic government not as an alternative ideal model of governing, but as a possible way of developing a more limitable governmental power. In his letter to Bazargan, who was the prime minister then, he says that this is not exactly what is happening in Iran. But he insists on his point on the existence of a right of the governed, which he further develops in his last article titled "Is it useless to revolt?" His idea is that legal institutions, constitutions, human rights, legal norms, by themselves never limit power, but revolts do. They produce certain institutional obligations or reactions, even though they cannot be positivized. They cannot become part of the institutional order. And the question I want to ask is that, do we have here a heterodox concept of an extra-institutional popular constitutionalism? The idea of a right of the governed can be regarded as populist insofar as it rests on an antagonistic relationship between the governed and the government and their governments, and a logic of solidarity that unifies the first based on their shared rejection of being governed in a given way. What is central here is the negation of what exists and not a program for future change. So we can see that we can use the idea to see if certain populist movements develop forms of counter-conduct and grassroots institutions which maintain a critical distance from the institutional forms that they result in, and to which we tend to reduce them to retroactively, as happens in the case of the Iranian Revolution, which it's called frequently the Islamic Revolution because it led to the Islamic Republic and to Khomeini. But if we see what's happening, the point of as long as it was an uprising, it had many things that are left out. So I'm gonna close my presentation with the insight that I propose we take away from the Iranian Revolution and Foucault's conceptualization, is that populist movements do create new grassroots counter-institutions, but they also seek to destitute, to abolish state or legal institutions without replacing them with new ones. They express a negativity that cannot be fully positivized, a rupture that cannot be institutionalized. But it can take the form of a negative right, an abolition, a partial and temporary state of freedom and equality. So this is an idea that I plan to, or can also be connected to this the problematic of destituent power, as opposed to constituent power that developed by Agamben, and the concept of revolutions by Asef Bayat, where he describes movements and revolutions of our time that do not produce either a revolutionary leadership or a new institutional setting, but they result in some reforms. And this is how he casts the Arab Spring movements. And possibly it can be operationalized, this idea of right of the governed, to analyze other contemporary movements. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Panayotis. Now we'll pass to Maryam Khan, who will speak about populism in Pakistan. Maryam.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for still being here at the end of a very long day. And I just want to quickly say a word of thanks to all the organizers of this conference, because after going through all these excellent presentations, I do realize that I'm somewhat of an outlier in this conversation, because I come from a very different part of the world, and yet there are commonalities and interesting common denominators, I'd say, that do resonate. But I'm just wondering if I can share my screen right now. Shall I go ahead? Okay.
Yes, please, of course.
Okay, perfect. So just to let you know, I'm from Pakistan, which means that at any given moment, the lights might actually go out, which means that I may be plunged in darkness, but I will continue to speak. And thank you so much, like I said, for remaining captive audience at the end of a long day. So I'm going to try and make this a little animated and visual for you, because I know Pakistan is really very difficult to kind of digest in 20 minutes. But as a comparative constitution-making scholar who looks at the global South and particularly the British post-colony, it's sort of difficult to not really speak about colonization. And when I looked at the call for this particular conference, I was struck by how it's very easy really to compartmentalize the notion of liberal constitutionalism, when I think once you kind of broaden the palette or broaden the case studies, if you will, into the conversation, you realize that liberalism has had many interesting and notorious accomplices along the way, insofar as structures of power around the globe are concerned. So I think I feel that, just looking at liberal constitutionalism in its isolated sort of territorial or geographical, canvas is perhaps misleading in many ways. And I know that there were one or two comments in the beginning which said, well, the system or the examples that you're describing are not really liberal constitutionalism, are they? And that got me thinking, and I actually added this particular slide just now, because I wanted to try and say something about how Pakistan's case fits into the conversation that we're having here. And I feel that, in order to sustain liberal constitutionalism, liberalism has gotten into various sorts of systems, alliances, coalitions around the globe, which have been really central to its own sustainability, but which have not been, liberal or constitutionalist in the classical sense. So what I wanted to speak about today was how liberal constitutionalism, from my vantage point, is very symbiotic with a number of different, structures of power across the, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. So you have colonization, you have Cold War imperialism, you even have what I would refer to as the neoliberal dictatorship of the post fall of Berlin Wall era. And Pakistan sits very neatly into this last category. It's a hybrid regime which came under a lot of pressure. It was a military state which came under a lot of pressure to democratize. And what it did was it adopted a lot of tooling from liberal constitutional contexts, but it really wasn't liberal other than just in a really sort of narrow formal sense. And that's what I'm referring to as dress-up constitutionalism. It's a post-colonial authoritarian context. It has a number of very interesting dualities of liberal versus illiberal, formal versus informal, religious versus secular. But the very interesting thing is that none of these systems has really won out. And Pakistan is a very interesting case where the constitutional contestation and all these issues still rages on. So that's one very interesting point of departure from Iran, the previous presentation, which is thoroughly interesting. But Pakistan remains a deadlocked system. And so my larger point really is, just like liberal constitutionalism in the post-World War II period, which is the period that I'm looking at insofar as Pakistan is concerned, the globalization of liberal constitutionalism has also gone hand in hand with the globalization of populism. So whenever you see a global tilt towards populism, let's say in the late 60s or the early 70s, which was a time of radical left politics, you saw populism in Pakistan. And now when you're seeing a global tilt towards right-wing populism, you once again see populism in Pakistan, and a very right-wing inspired one. So I think these sorts of imitations and mimicries are really important because they tell you how all these fundamentally illiberal and authoritarian contexts are also so deeply entwined into broader sort of global conversations, right? So just a quick prefatory point here. So Pakistan's hybrid regime, what do I mean by that? This is a term which is used again and again in the literature, and what it means is that you have a situation where military political power is paramount, it's dominant, but it is not uncontested. So it is not an entirely military state, but it has a number of facets or elements of electoral democracy, and it does episodically get contested by elected representatives, and so it goes into this circuitous kind of a trend where you have the military, which is omnipresent, but you oftentimes have elected governments which will push back against the military's power. And so the hybrid regime abhors populists. You might think, oh, well, it's an authoritarian context, so you'll have a lot of populism, but that's not true, because the military never contests elections, which means that it always needs to maintain control. And the way to do that always is to try and engineer elections in a way that you will always have like a small margin majority government or like a coalition government, which is easily controllable. So the hybrid regime always abhors populists, and that makes it even more interesting, the emergence of populism in Pakistan, every time you see a global tilt towards some kind of populist politics. And just to kind of take this further, this is a tale of two populists from Pakistan. And it's just meant to highlight that even within a hybrid regime context like Pakistan, you have had examples of both left-wing and right-wing populism, right? So it's really interesting how populism pathways can vary quite dramatically, even within the same system. You had Zulfikar Ali Bhutto from the 1970s, who led the Pakistan People's Party. I'm looking at other presentations, really interesting commonalities of how a lot of these parties are known as the People's Parties. So this was our People's Party. And then in contemporary Pakistan, you may have come across the name of Imran Khan, who was a celebrity cricketer turned politician. And he came to power in 2018, but earlier this year, he was in fact pushed out of government through a vote of no confidence. That's something I'll come to later. But both of these have had to negotiate their way within a hybrid state context. And so I'll start, I'll give you a very kind of quick, long arc view of the constitution making process or political process in Pakistan. And, the story, as you know, begins in 47 with decolonization. And this is a story very similar to other countries in South Asia, with perhaps the big difference being that India went in for elections as early as 1950. Pakistan delayed those elections, and it delayed those primarily because the military bureaucratic faction within Pakistan was much stronger, and it allied with the US during the Cold War, and that just kind of completely distorted its politics. But there was a strong inheritance, if you will, of liberal constitutional principles. You will see this across South Asia. India, as I said, is a ubiquitous example. You have periodic elections, you have written constitutions, you have a parliamentary system that politicians really deeply feel passionate about. You have some federal principles thrown in there because these are mostly federal countries. They're too huge to be unitary states. You have independent judiciaries. In fact, some of you might know that Pakistan and India both have some of the most activist judiciaries in the world, I'd say. In Pakistan, in particular, if you put aside what is happening in India right now, which is the Modi government, which is becoming way too religiously motivated, if you put that aside, India was always quoted as the secular constitutional state in South Asia. Pakistan was meant to be like a counterfoil. It was the Islamic state. But even then, if you look at the Constitution of Pakistan, there's a very interesting merging of both these principles. And as I said, the liberal and the Islamic go together, and they are in constant sort of conflict with each other. There's also in the Pakistani socioeconomic landscape a huge imbalance between strong political parties and representative institutions on the one hand, and unrepresentative bureaucracies, which draw from the Indian civil service and the colonial era British Indian Army. So those have always been extremely powerful, and there are reasons why that is the case in Pakistan and not so much in India, but I won't go into those right now. This was the broader context: decolonization, state-making, deep contestations between liberal and illiberal principles. And then what happened was that, as I told you, there was a complete alignment with the US during the Cold War. And what that did was that it completely displaced whatever representative forces there were in the country. The Constituent Assembly was dissolved as early as 1954. That's barely a few years into decolonization. And there was a military coup after a decade, which is in 1958. You may also be interested in knowing that in the 1960s, Pakistan was led by a military general by the name of General Ayub Khan. He's the middle image on this slide. And Ayub Khan, a secular, military leader, leads Pakistan into its development miracle. A lot of people wrote about it at that time. Gustav Papanek basically suggested, Pakistan was the miracle of Asian economies, and it was going to be the precedent setting exercise for a lot of post-colonial and authoritarian contexts in Pakistan, how they should be developing. Interestingly, of course, that miracle collapsed in on itself because the foundations on which it was based completely drew from Cold War politics and the United States, military aid. And during this time, what happened was this interesting map that you see here. This was Pakistan in green. So this is really interesting, right? This is a state which is divided by 1,000 miles of Indian territory, India being a hostile neighbor of Pakistan. So you can imagine what an interesting situation that made. You have West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and it's very hard for them to communicate. And most of your power centers are in West Pakistan, abutting Afghanistan and Iran, what is Pakistan today, in fact. And there is so much East-West disparity. During the 1960s, Ayub Khan's reign is actually responsible in many ways for that disparity, because it really goes on to a whole new level. And then on the other side, there is also disparity in the sense of class disparity. This is regional disparity, and then there's class disparity, where you have this narrative which emerges from the development miracle, which is that only 22 families in Pakistan possess something like over 70 to 80% of the country's wealth. So the development miracle really is built on this extremely unequal distribution of economic power, and the bureaucracy, which is to begin with very elitist and a colonial era sort of fixture, becomes extremely corrupt in the process, which leads into another interesting thing that you might be find fascinating, is that the radical movement of the left in the late 60s, which engulfs many parts of the world, France included, I believe, also finds reverberations in Pakistan on the heels of this development miracle, because there is so much socioeconomic inequality, and your industrial labor is so is really so deeply mobilized. It's a very radical movement which brings together labor and students. And Pakistan, interestingly, is one of the success stories of the radical movement of the late 60s, because it is successful in pushing out its first military dictator, who was Ayub Khan. But that regime change, unfortunately, passes hands from one military strongman to another, who's Yahya Khan, who's the bottom image on the slide. And Yahya Khan, however, is forced to actually hold elections. And that's where the story really changes, because once you entertain the idea of mass politics through free and fair direct elections, one man, one vote, then the calculations can completely go out of hand. And that's what happens. And in 71, in the 71 elections, East Pakistan wins an enormous majority. And that leads into a military debacle. It leads into a military operation in East Pakistan. And you must know that there was a military genocide. And in 1971, East Pakistan separates and becomes Bangladesh. And because of this massive upheaval, there is, of course, a major political setback for the military. And that sets the stage for the first tale of populism in Pakistan, which is in 1971, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who is the leader of the Pakistan People's Party. He is the winning sort of majority in what is left of Pakistan in 71. And he holds something like over 70% of the assembly. So this is a huge majority and a nightmare, a complete nightmare, if you will, for the military establishment. First being the secession, and then Bhutto taking over, and the bureaucracy is weakened in this process. The 22 notorious families that have accumulated so much wealth come under fire. The PPP's program is extremely left because it draws from the social movement of the late 60s. It's based on nationalization, land reform, worker peasant rights, various other socioeconomic reforms that really involve a huge state expansion. Bhutto also is known for breaking away from Pakistan's complete alignment with the US in the Cold War. He introduces a policy of bilateralism, and he's also responsible for actually making the first democratic constitution of Pakistan, which has survived today, despite many suspensions and various other changes in it. But this was Pakistan's first democratic constitution. There's a lot of centralization in the 70s because, as you can imagine, in an authoritarian state, the PPP is always watching over its shoulder to see whether the military might want to kind of throw it out. There may be other sort of right-wing alliances that want to kind of push it out. But on the other hand, it's also relying way too much on executive power. And it's kind of keeping the assembly on the back burner. And so because of that centralization of executive power, you have a recrudescence of military power and another military coup in 77. And you must know that Bhutto was hanged in 1979. And that's also the year, I think, of the Iranian Revolution. And then you have the new trajectory, as I call it. So it's the making of the hybrid regime. This is where the hybrid regime begins, because, as I said, a hybrid regime is actually defined as a regime which holds multi-party elections, not party-less elections, and not like just token elections. These are multi-party elections. And the trend begins after General Zia's military dictatorship that overthrows Bhutto's government. And this is a military dictatorship for sure. This is the time where the Soviet-Afghan war begins. This is the time when Pakistan becomes a proxy for the military's war in Afghanistan. This is where that story begins. That infamous story starts for General Zia al-Haq. And after General Zia's death in 87, that's time when the decade of the 90s begins. And this is where the neoliberal agenda surfaces, right? The neoliberal agenda, as you would know, the Washington Consensus, which says, privatize, deregulate, pressure to democratize. It's known as the two-party democratic transition in the 90s, but it's really not a democratic transition as we know now. It's a bit of a farce because there's a lot of liberal tooling which is involved here. There are elections happening, but the military tries every means possible in its repertoire to control and engineer those elections, to actually back certain military-sponsored political parties that it creates itself. And so that's the 90s for you. But there is another political party in the 90s, which is not, I wouldn't call it populist, but what happens is that it gains a big majority. And before it can really do anything, it's pushed out by another military dictator. And that's General Pervez Musharraf. Hello. You can see the cycle kind of going round and round. This is Pervez Musharraf of the War on Terror fame. So this is the military strongman who is now once again co-opted by the United States to fight its war once again in Afghanistan. And we have another 10 years of a hybrid kind of a situation where it's a dictatorship, but the dictator is also holding multi-party elections, but obviously he's trying very hard to control them. But in 2008, there's the lawyers' movement, another very interesting episode. I'm not going to go into details, but again, the military is pushed out. So you see this happening episodically, right? Elected civilians throwing out dictators, dictators taking control back. And in 2008, the military says, okay, we cannot go in with another martial law. We can simply not afford to go in for a full-blown martial law / military government style of takeover, because it's backfiring too much. So they move into the model of the 90s again, where they try and pick politicians, potential political leaders, parties, try and create those parties in their own labs, try and engineer them. And when they engineer those parties, a particular party, you have as its leader Mr. Imran Khan, who is backed completely by the military establishment. They try and get him in. I mean, they've been trying since 2010 to get Mr. Imran Khan in, but he's just not getting elected. And finally, what he gets elected on is a one-point agenda, which is anti-corruption. Because now you have a political class in the 90s going into the post-Musharraf era, which is corrupt. I mean, which party is not corrupt in a context like this? But it's easy to scapegoat them. And so you have a one-point anti-corruption agenda. You have new middle-class constituencies that really buy into this anti-corruption agenda, because they're being constantly told, this political class is corrupt. They have basically looted or stolen your wealth, the country's wealth, and siphoned it off into sort of, countries abroad, Swiss bank accounts, whatnot. You do know about the Panama Papers scandal. And the incumbent government in 2017 is somebody, the prime minister, who's actually named in the Panama Papers. It's a great time for the hybrid regime to knock him out. And they knock him out. They don't knock him out through a martial law. They knock him out through the judiciary. And that's why you have a really fantastic activist judiciary, but it's actually a heavily military controlled judiciary, even though it gives off the facade of a really sort of independent judiciary. So you have engineered elections 2018, the right wing is strengthened, it's all brokered by the military until things start going wrong. There's misgovernance, there's economic decline. The Transparency Corruption Index is showing that Imran Khan's government is even more corrupt than those he was accusing of corruption. So there's an interesting paradox that emerges. Earlier this year, there was a vote of no confidence against Mr. Imran Khan. It was facilitated once again by the military. We are back to the old corrupt politicians. And so we've seen this sort of cycle, but we've seen two very different populist regimes. Some of the common denominators, and of course, when you start looking at nuances, they're not very common, but these are the broad ones, which I would say could be articulated in a broad fashion. So one of them is alienation from the elite and the phenomenon of othering. So the non-elite class could be your working class, as happened in the late 60s, or it could be the middle classes that have happened more recently. It could be left, it could be right, but the common factor is alienation from the elite. The second one is alienation from the status quo. So you're not happy with the establishment forces, whether they're from the political class, the military class, bureaucratic class. And anti-imperialist narrative, Bhutto spoke about, pulling Pakistan away from the US. Imran Khan today also has been speaking about a US conspiracy to overthrow him, which is, of course, a total lie, but it works because anything anti-US works. Finally, there is the executive power problem in populist politics, because the messiahs of populism believe that they can actually go beyond the limits of the constitutional framework and appeal directly to the masses. And the final point, which is very interesting, is there will always be military backlash. against populists because they're simply not acceptable. They are uncontrollable. So I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Maryam. Now we pass to our audience. Whoever wants to raise a question or short comment, please raise your hand. Ifigeneia.
No, thank you. Not for the moment. I want just to congratulate Maryam.
Thank you, Ifigeneia.
Thank you.
Ilker.
Hi, thank you. Well, Maryam, very impressive presentation. I just want to note that Ziya ul Haq was the best friend of Kenan Evren back in Turkey in the 80s, who was also a military leader of the coup. And I remember when I was a kid, the Ziya ul Haq was coming a lot to Turkey. Secondly, also Pervez Musharraf was a very good friend of Turkey, and he was speaking very good Turkish. I mean, you couldn't really recognize his accent from a vernacular Turkish person. Having said that, I have seen many commonalities with the Turkish military history, which is a little bit away now, but in the 70s and 80s. But I just want to ask, you said military despised the populists all the time, but is there any convergence versus military between military and populist, right-wing populist in Pakistan's history, and how was it like?
Thank you.
Would you prefer to go around and take some questions and then come back to?
Yes, it's not going to be individualized. It will be exactly the same as it was in the previous panels. So I would kindly ask members of the audience, whomever wants to raise a question, to raise your hands or type your question to the chat. Charalambos, you will have the opportunity to speak, I'm afraid, answering to questions posed to you. I don't know whether...
Not to pose questions to the others of the panel.
If I open such an opportunity, I think that we will lose our audience. So I would prefer first to have from the audience, Allan.
Thank you. I would stay, even if the panelists are granted the right to pose questions to each other, I swear. I really enjoyed the presentations, but I must admit that it's very far from something that I know very much of in advance, so I can't really pose good questions to your presentations. Apart from one that might be, I don't know, very perhaps a small detail to you, Panayotis. It was this idea about the right of the what was the formulation? The right of the governed, the rights of the governed as something negative. I was just thinking, isn't I don't know. I was just thinking that the experience of that right being denied is something negative, but the idea of a right for a governed, just a thought, but isn't it more like in the register of the imaginative or something like that? And then when it's negated, you have a sort of a negative experience. It's just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Allan. Akritas.
Thank you. It's not actually a question, it's more of a thought. I was too impressed by Maryam's forceful presentation, and I think Maryam reminds us that the Western liberal democracy was, at least to a large part or to a part, premised on imperialism and colonialism abroad. And it is very interesting the perspective she brings with her paper, because unlike, or not necessarily in the same way as the Iranian Revolution, in a very clear way, we have the phenomenon of populism as a reaction to colonialism and associated with decolonialism. I think that while populism studies have predominantly focused so far on a comparison between two large families of populist phenomena, between European and Latin American populisms, this brings us a new perspective, which is very interesting on its own right, but it also helps illuminating our own examinations with our own populisms in European countries. That was just my thought, and I thank all of the panelists, but especially Maryam, for this very refreshing perspective that she brought us. Thank you.
Thank you, Akritas. I assume that Ifigeneia wishes to speak, having raised her hand twice. So please, Ifigeneia.
This time it was a raised hand. Thank you. I would like to thank all three intervenants and say that I enjoyed very much Charalambos' paper because it puts together political science and constitutional thought. And I have a kind of question to Panayotis. It's not a question, it's some thoughts. Okay, Foucault stays on a very well-known historical phenomenon, insurrection. It's old. I don't believe that Foucault didn't remember that once Paris people entered the palace and hated the king. And this insurrection sometimes leads not to a revolution. It's not the same thing, the insurrection and the revolution. The revolution usually creates a subject. Speaking of a right, and this is a juridical term, of something not existing, if the moment is to destitute, you destitute and all is over. Nothing else. You don't reclaim power. You don't want to establish a new regime. It's a contradiction in terms. To speak about right, you have a subject. You need a subject. So institutionalize an empirical phenomenon in such a way, I think it's not very useful, not very proper. And going to the third very instructive paper, I think that Maryam showed us how the need for national independence, it can be also a democratic claim. And I really don't know very well Bhutto's regime. But after her presentation, I think it was more an effort to democratize, to liberate institutions from the custody of foreign forces and military forces, and to establish a democratic constitution, a democratic regime. Thank you.
Angus.
Yeah, I thought all three papers were brilliant. I have a question for Maryam in particular, which is that thinking about particularly thinking around the constitutional crisis, the most recent constitutional crisis in Pakistan and the dismissal of Imran Khan, and comparing it in some ways to the similar crisis over the prorogation of Parliament in the UK a few years ago. I wondered the extent to which you think, the very regularized method of constitutional control exerted in Pakistan and the very tightly enforced legal constitution is actually kind of part and parcel of the attempt to construct a hybrid authoritarian regime, in the sense that whereas, on kind of a liberal interpretation, having a very strict constitution would in some ways prevent authoritarianism, it seems in the case of Pakistan to in some ways facilitate the removal of leaders by kind of entrenched judicial, bureaucratic and military elites. Now, I don't think the prorogation in the United Kingdom was a good thing, but it struck me that there was real political contestation over the issue, and the ensuing chaos suggested that there was a kind of degree of indeterminacy, in the sense that no one had the ability to just change the government. And I wonder if the very tight constitutional mechanism is part and parcel of the authoritarian structure. That was a slightly incoherent thought, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Angus. I will have a question too to Charalambos concerning his historical narrative. Your account of July 1965 takes it that the people were demonstrating, defending not the actual constitution, but some popular sovereignty that could, in the event that the king is not does not behave very well, could lead to another constitution. I want somehow to, there's another element of the period that sits uncomfortably with this narrative, and it is the insistence of the left, and I assume for a part of the demonstrators as well, that they were defending legality. Of course, not the legality of laws, constitutional laws, which abolished the Communist Party and all the special dictatorial measures of that period, but the constitution itself could, even if conservative, it was a democratic constitution, and people believed that they were defending constitutional legality. And for another part of your narrative, I have also a comment. Without disagreeing again, I agree that people in 1965, they were demonstrating for popular sovereignty too. In 74, Karamanlis very soon abolished the most heavy, let's say, element of this conservative post-Civil War edifice. He legalized the Communist Party. He abolished the prohibition of the Communist Party. So the disparity between the draft constitution in spring and June 1975 and the final one, I mean, there were demonstrations from the beginning, early on, and obviously they played a role. But was it so crucial, taking into account that the basic, let's say, problem of Greek political life, the banning of a political party, had been fixed many months ago? That's my questions, and I pass the floor to you, Charalambos, and you may use your time to raise questions to the other panelists.
Costa, I'm sorry. Anders wants to take the floor again.
Sorry to intervene like that. It's actually Mikkel. My apologies. I hope you get a chance quickly to ask a question. Well, I just wanted to join in and congratulate everyone for some absolutely amazing presentations. I've learned a lot. I just had two quick questions for Panayotis about the presentation. One is more or less empirical. I wanted to inquire if you could perhaps specify, you made a brief comment about the sort of originality or the Iranian Revolution potentially being the first modern revolution, which I'm a little bit sort of confounded by. The things you mentioned were present in, for instance, the strikes and some of these things were present at least in the Russian Revolution. So I was very interested in what sort of, what the novelty was or what you were pointing to there. If you could specify that would be great. And then perhaps also if you would elaborate on this notion of constituent power that has become somewhat popular in some radical theory context, and I struggle somewhat with it, perhaps especially in the Agambinian formulations where you play with ball, whatever that means, and it becomes somewhat. It's not very well defined. I think there are some problems in the conceptualization. So I'd be very interested because I recently heard someone critique this notion and ask if this wasn't just like a half-baked revolution where you don't actually get anywhere, like you may depose, and of course there's some issues about how you conceptualize this. Is it a right? Are you still governed if you've destituted these institutions? But also, was that actually what happened for a large part of that movement? So they destitute one power or one constituted power, and somebody else can then come in and constitute a new power because they do not seize that moment. Is there does it just create a vacuum, or do you have to somehow consolidate something in order to have a political basis there? So yeah, any comment on that would be more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. I pass the floor again to Charalambos in order to say whatever.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much, Costas, both for your remarks but also for the whole presentation. On the first question about the left and its demand posed by Elias EU, the left leader that I mentioned before, who said explicitly that we will keep on the legality and we will smash you with legality, speaking to the right-wing leader. I have to say that this strategy, which was according to my point of view, justified during the 50s and the early 60s, during, for example, the period of the unyielding struggle, did not understand that in the July of 1965, we had an intensification of the political struggle that left should have supported, and it didn't. And the Elias EU was again very good in describing it, not in answering it in the way that I would like, but in posing it. He said, speaking in the parliament, that the people posed the question of a referendum. We, as EDA, we don't support it. In order to say to the establishment that we can find a solution, a modus vivendi, we and you. But this was not the case. And with the military coup of 1965, I think the coup proved it. So we had in July, Bernardakis and Mavris said that it was a premature May 68. So you had to pose the questions in a different way. When people says just 114, you have to take this in mind. When they say 114 and referendum, it's another thing. And the left, unfortunately, did not respond. Andreas Papandreou said that in this period, we have made the first connections with the masses that helped us after the collapse of the dictatorship to form PASOK and overpass the left, the traditional left, with our rhetoric. Okay, it's a big question. I don't want to expand more, but thank you very much for posing it. As for Karamanlis, it's true. It was very important. Maybe the key element of the parallel constitution was the ban of the Communist Party, but it was a whole institutional edifice. I remind you of the fact that it was also the tool for sending people to the exile, of taking their nationality, of suppressing the trade unions. All these, according to the draft constitution, remained. Okay. And then it was the final text that said, okay, we have, if I remember well, 6 months in order to deal with it, and then it's over. And also, it's the whole. If you see from the day that Karamanlis comes in Greece, there is a constant zigzag. There is the popular pressure and there is the establishment pressure. And you can see it, for example, about the colonels. Firstly, the amnesty included the colonels. And then, some months later, said that no, it did not include the colonels. And there are many other such examples, but I don't want to take more time, because I think that Maryam is the key person of this debate, and no, it's justified. It was very interesting. I don't want to say more. You have many questions to respond. I just remembered when you were speaking about Imran Khan, that I had conversations with Pakistan workers who live here in Greece, and they were very much hoping to Imran Khan, and they said that he's not corrupt. And he reminded me, in this framework that we discussed today, the feeling of the people in the 60s for Georgios Papandreou, who was not a leftist, but there was many hope that he will reverse the situation. He is not dependent from the establishment. He is more independent even towards the United States, because the United States plays a role. And it's very impressive for me because Pakistan is, we have many Pakistani immigrants here, and the same time that Pakistan is a nuclear power. Okay, it's a contradiction, but okay. And just a very small thing on what Panayotis has said. I think that the attitude of Foucault towards Iranian Revolution is an equivalent of what he has written during the 60s and 70s, saying that I am for the right to resist, but revolution and Marxism and all this stuff leads to totalitarianism in a way. And so there was, according to my readings, there was revolutionary institutionalization in the Iranian Revolution. There were workers' councils. I remember even the name. There were Soras, the name of them. And there was Tudeh, the Communist party who made an alliance with the Ayatollahs. There were the Maoist Mujahedins who were balancing from an absolute
I'm sorry, Babis. I will wrap it up.
Sorry, but
please wrap it up.
Yes, I end. Sorry, and thank you very much. Sorry, Costas.
You're welcome. Panayotis, please, it's your turn.
Thank you for all your very, very, very valuable and challenging thoughts. I'll start with Allan. In his question, from how I recollect, is whether there is a more fundamental right when we talk about the right of the governed, that is not negative, but is something more fundamental. So, because most of the question has to do with the same issue, just to clarify some things, the negative aspect is part of my reading. And Foucault just doesn't use the term negative, he uses the term right of the governed. Why I edited it is because I connected it with, I think it's connected with idea of a negative liberty vis-a-vis a positive liberty, as we know from Isaiah Berlin. And what is negative about it? It's not its quality. It's that it has to do with limits. It has to do with posing some boundaries, some red lines to governments. It has to do what they cannot do to the governed. So that's the negative aspect. And it's also, so why does, what's the political stake here? Of course, it's an effort by Foucault to think about revolution and uprising and resistance in post-revolutionary terms or post-sovereignist terms. Of course, the right of the governed is something that is produced. It's not something that is fundamental. And it is produced by the uprising, by the actions themselves. So, and this goes to also to Ifigeneia's comment. Allan is right to point out, I think, that there has to be another negation for a negative right of the governed to arise. And I would like to connect this with some empirical cases. We have now in Iran an uprising, a feminist uprising maybe, because of the murder of Mahsa Amini, and by women who don't want to wear the veil anymore, and they burn their veils. Do they have a right to do so, or they try to produce a right of not having to wear the veil? This idea of Foucault is that there are some extra institutional ways for the governed to win some things, to win some concessions, or to impose some obligations to governments. And it's also his effort to think both in individual and in collective terms. So, of course, I'll pass now to Ifigeneia's thought of whether it's is it a useful concept? It's something that we need to discuss. Of course, there is this distinction between an uprising and a revolution. A revolution is when the uprising succeeds and builds a new institutional order, establishes new rights, etc. What I wanted to so I wanted to move away from the idea of a constituent power, but I do not believe that the Foucault's idea is the same as Agamben's idea of a constituent power. It's not, and it's nice how you put it, because constituent power means just abolition, doesn't replace it with anything. And if we want to understand what it's where Agamben gets this idea from, it's from Benjamin. It's his idea that we will break with the dialectic of revolutions and counter-revolutions, and there is going to be a kind of violence that just ends everything. But Foucault I don't think he thinks in this way. He thinks in the way of how we can politically and historically produce some obligations to the government or impose some limits without becoming a fully and wholly part of the institutions. And he also ascribes a universality. And it's an interesting conception to this kind of the rights of the governed. So I'll go to Andres now. This explanation about the Iranian Revolution being the first modern revolution. There are two aspects: the situation, the socioeconomic context, and the means used. You're right that in the Russian Revolution there were strikes and Soviets, and that's how it was achieved. But the urbans in Iran in '78, over 50% of the population of the country were in the cities, were in the urban centers, and were in the revolution. Whereas in Russia, the percentage of the population that participated in the revolution and that were in the urban centers and the factories was very, very, very small, because it wasn't a developed capitalist country in the same way that Iran was in '78. That was the clarification. So yes, as I said before, the right of the government can have this constituent aspect of just wanting to abolish some restrictions, as the mandatory veil, or wanting to. Let's also think about the George Floyd protests in the US. What were the people there? What right did they claim? Were they claiming for a better police or for a police that stops killing? Black people. So there is this angle that you just want to stop something. You don't want to create a better, a more police that functions inside the legal boundaries. But you might get that, and they did get that with or the same thing happened in Ferguson. So there is a revolt, and then there is you put a break that is temporary and is partial, but this produces a kind of a right. And this is why I try to put this idea just to think about movements and uprisings of our time, because there are many, in a way that maybe escapes this idea of claiming constituent power, popular sovereignty, and a new order, either liberal or revolutionary. And I go back to Charalambos' comment. It's the same question, because there were the revolutionary left, there were the Soras. It was on my slides, and this was part of the revolution, a very part of the revolution. But after Khomeini and the Islamic Republic, they were eradicated. And it's also interesting what happened with the Soras, because there were workers' councils, and the new government, the revolutionary government, gave them this dilemma: you either become an Islamic council or you get repressed. So this whole thinking is an effort to kind of save these moments. Yes, if that side had won, they would have had a new revolutionary order. They would institutionalize their programs, but this didn't happen. So I really liked all your thoughts, and something that I'm gonna work with more. Thank you.
Okay, Maryam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your really great questions, and also some very generous comments. And I just want to say that I've learned so much from this conference as well. I was hesitant, as I told you, when I applied, because I typically don't go beyond my sort of Anglo-Saxon world of the Commonwealth and the US. So engaging with this forum was a truly enlightening experience for me. And I would really hope that, people who are doing comparative theory and other comparative constitutionalism would look at Pakistan broadly, as outsiders, because it is true that it's full of contradictions. It's fertile ground for a lot of study. That certainly is there. I mean, this is a country whose first military coup in '58 was legitimized on the basis of Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law. So this is a very interesting context. And yes, the military has also drawn a lot from the Turkish example. And so the Pakistan-Turkey sort of bond has been extremely close. It's been very intimate. And as you know, from the 1950s onwards, mid-50s onwards, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey were also part of this conglomerate known as the Baghdad Pact, or the Central Treaty Organization, in alignment with the US. So Pakistan and Turkey do go back a long way. The question about right-wing populists, the hybrid regime in Pakistan has never gone for right-wing populism, simply because right-wingers, interestingly, another contradiction, have never won at the ballot boxes. They have consistently been defeated, despite the fact that it is a society, a social fabric, which is really full of religiosity, sectarianism. Shia-Sunni conflict is rife. Minorities are treated really horribly. And yet you will find that Islamists, right-wingers, or fundamentalists have never really won elections. And that's the silver lining here, I guess. But no, right-wing actors, however, have always been junior partners whenever the hybrid state wants to create sort of street disturbances, wants to create some kind of street power to overthrow a government which it feels is, by its own standards, not living up to its own goals. So that's the question about right-wing populism. The other question was about, whether this impression that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was trying to democratize Pakistan. And I'm sympathetic to that view because I am at many levels a big admirer of Bhutto, and then also his political heir and daughter, Benazir Bhutto, who was assassinated back in 2007. And I'm an admirer because of the potential that they held for changing the political terrain of Pakistan. But alas, military power is too deep. Which is why we call it the deep state. But coming back to also the other point I made about executive power, the problem with populism, and of course, Bhutto was part of the democratization attempt, the first one that failed in the 70s. But one of the reasons that it did fail was also because a democratic party, or a party that came in democratically, very quickly kind of turned populist. It turned populist precisely because it was such a huge majority. It did not have the military or the bureaucracy to check its powers. And so it was a pendular movement. It went to the other end where, a civilian representative gained so much power, and with so much concentration of executive power, it's easy to then try and capture it again as well, right? Because he did not strengthen the assembly. And that came back to haunt him. So I would ultimately, in the ultimate analysis, I would call him a populist. Insofar as, the question about Pakistan's constitutional structure being also very well attuned to this kind of hybrid politics, I think that's how I read your question. And, once again, Pakistan's case is really crucial in illuminating this huge gap between norms of power, constellations of power, and what the Constitution says. So a lot of theorizing around, how constitutional design and constitutional text really matters to constitutional outcomes actually just goes out the window when you start studying Pakistan, because the norms of power are really not aligned with the norms of constitutional design, which is why I think for Pakistan, and even broadly for that kind of theorizing, I think it's always so important to interrogate power, when you're talking about constitutional design. So I'm going to stop here because I don't want to drag this evening. It's 9 p.m. here. I think it's 7 p.m. at your end. But thank you so much for such an engaging discussion. I'm really enthused. Thank you.
Thank you, Maryam. I thank all the panelists, and perhaps Ifigeneia or Akritas would like to close this workshop with a few words.
Akritas.
Thank you, Ifigeneia. This was a very intense and very fruitful today's seminar. I think it was a huge success. It met, perhaps even surpassed our expectations, and gives us hope that we can organize another event in summer 2023, where you are all cordially invited to participate. I will just want to thank each and every one of you, the panelists, the attendees, the discussants, and please allow me to just thank the people of our team. First of all, Professor Ifigeneia Kamtsidou, who is the heart and soul of the project, and then our dear friends and colleagues from our partner institution, the University of Nicosia, Cyprus Law School, Professors Christo Pavastilianou and Costas Stratilati, the members of our team, Eleni Kalambakou, Iasona Koutoufaris Malandrino, Aspa Theochari, Dimitri Patsika, Mihaly Mita. I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. And I am personally very satisfied that the level of all the panels and all the papers was very high, and we intend to plan a publication of our papers, and you will soon learn more about it. We will send you a message for our planned publication, and so we hope that we can institutionalize and further this cooperation, and we certainly do hope that we have more exchanges in the future. Unless Ifigeneia has something more to add, I thank you all, and wishing you all the best, and have a nice weekend. And I do hope that we meet very soon on other occasions. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you and congrats. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.